The Doomsday Clock is now the closest it's ever been to midnight. What's up, guys? Welcome back to another video, and you might have seen this hitting the headlines all over the place because the Doomsday Clock has been adjusted again. This doesn't happen all the time. This is not an annual thing. This happens just when there's some sort of change. The Doomsday Clock is managed by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. It's a symbolic representation of how close we are to a global catastrophe. Usually this is referring to like a man-made catastrophe, not natural disasters and storms and things like that, but mainly to do with nuclear power, nuclear weapons and things like that. Now, it was created in 1947, more or less the start of our nuclear arms when they started to be developed. Obviously, the bombs dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, but this is when they started the Doomsday Clock, and they set it at an arbitrary number to begin with, which was 7 minutes to midnight, based purely on the nuclear tensions between the US and the Soviet Union at the time. It then wasn't touched till 1949, where the Soviets successfully tested their first nuclear weapon, ending the US's monopoly on nuclear arms. That was then set to 3 minutes to midnight. Again, 4 more years passes with no changes, and then it's set to 2 minutes to midnight. Both the US and Soviet Union testing nuclear weapons, hydrogen bombs, for the first time, and starting that arms race, that Cold War arms race that we all know about. In 1960, there was efforts to reduce nuclear tensions, including global awareness of nuclear risks, development of arms control talks. That was set then to 7 minutes to midnight, so obviously getting safer there. In 1963, it was put all the way back to 12 minutes to midnight, the furthest we'd been from midnight since the clock's conception. And that was because the US and Soviet Union signed a partial nuclear test ban treaty, limiting nuclear tests in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. In 1968, it was set back to 7 minutes to midnight because of the Vietnam War, the Six-Day War in the Middle East, and rapid nuclear proliferation. This had completely reversed the optimism from the previous setting of the clock. In 1969, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed, creating hope, global cooperation, and to curb the spread of nuclear weapons. Then we go through to 1972, where it's pushed back even further, back to 12 minutes to midnight, as the US and Soviet Union signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which limited certain types of nuclear weapon systems. 1974, attention turned away from the United States and USA as India conducted their first nuclear test, and concerns grew about further nuclear escalation with other countries. In 1980, it came closer again to 7 minutes to midnight, with the increased Cold War tensions, including the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And a stalled arms control process caused global anxiety. 1981, we were only 4 minutes from midnight as we go back to the US and Soviet Union both escalating their arms race and modernizing nuclear arsenals and introducing weapons like cruise missiles. 1984, great year I was born. 3 minutes to midnight. Height of Cold War tensions saw near total breakdown of US and Soviet relations, including the deployment of intermediate range nuclear weapons in Europe. 1990, though, as the Cold War thawed, the fall of the Berlin Wall, reduced military budgets, and arms reduction agreements, like the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. And the good times kept rolling through the 90s. 1991, set all the way back to 17 minutes to midnight. The US and Soviet Union signed Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, and the Soviet Union dissolved, marking the total end of the Cold War and the furthest the clock has ever been from midnight. 4 years of this relative calm until the clock has to be adjusted again in 1995 to 14 minutes to midnight. Concerns grew about nuclear smuggling. And this is down to the collapse of the Soviet Union and Soviet-era nuclear systems being dismantled and parts sold on, things like this. And very slow progress on arms reduction that had been agreed to beforehand. In 1998, we saw it go to 9 minutes to midnight. Nothing to do with the Soviet Union, Russia, or the US this time. This is India and Pakistan both conducting nuclear tests around the same time, meaning there could have possibly been a regional nuclear conflict. In 2002, we moved to 7 minutes to midnight, and this is where our countdown just starts going down and down. After the 9/11 attacks, the US withdrew from the anti-ballistic missile treaty, and fears started to grow massively about nuclear terrorism. In 2007, we got to 5 minutes to midnight. This is down to two factors. One, North Korea doing a nuclear test, creating another nation, an unstable nation with nuclear power, but also they started to factor in climate change as a factor of the calculation that they do to set the clock. So failure to curb carbon emissions obviously reduced time as well. A little spike up in 2010 as we moved to 6 minutes to midnight. Global cooperation improved and the New START treaty was signed between the US and Russia. And there was mass international effort to reduce climate change. But pie in the sky, a lot of that, we get to 2012 and we're back down to 5 minutes again because of slow action on nuclear disarmament and slow action on addressing climate change. So basically, over them 2 years, they hadn't really done much of stuff that they'd promised to do, and it just made the clock reduce even further. In 2015, we got to 3 minutes to midnight, the closest we'd been to midnight since 1984. And the reason for this was the bulletin cited unchecked climate change, nuclear modernization programs, and weak international efforts to address global risks. In 2017, we get to 2.5 minutes to midnight. This is increased tensions and rhetoric between the USA and North Korea and many more North Korean nuclear tests, and rising nationalism across the world. In 2018, we got to 2 minutes to midnight. Global political instability was a massive factor in this, as well as them quoting climate inaction. Not just slow on climate, but no action at all. They are not doing anything about climate change at this stage. And the lack of arms control means this was the closest we'd been to midnight since 1953. 2020, now it's bad news when the whole system's based on minutes to midnight and we have to go into seconds just so it doesn't sound as bad. We set it to 100 seconds to midnight. The bulletin moved to seconds for the first time due to worsening climate conditions, cyber threats, nuclear tensions, and disinformation. Fake news. 2023, just last year, we got to 90 seconds to midnight, the closest we've ever been to midnight since this clock was conceived. The ongoing war within Ukraine, the constant threat of nuclear weapon usage. And again, the bulletin blaming accelerated climate change. Now, January 2025, we've moved again. But we daren't move any closer. How can we possibly move it another minute, another half minute? No, we've moved to 89 seconds to midnight. 1 second difference from last year. Do you believe it's just 1 second difference? Personally, I think there's a lot more threats coming into this year. But they've moved it anyway. 89 seconds to midnight is what we are now. The closest we have ever been to midnight. And let me just reiterate, this is the Doomsday Clock. This is the closest we've ever been, not to a fictitious time, but to total self-annihilation. We are on the verge of destroying ourselves, be that climate, be that World War III. Whatever they decide is the current threat is what sets the clock, but just look around you. I'm going to read what they said as they set the clock. It is the determination of the Science and Security Board of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists that the world has not made sufficient progress on existential risks threatening all of humanity. We thus move the clock forward. In setting the clock closer to midnight, we send a stark signal. Because the world is already perilously closer to the precipice, any move towards midnight should be taken as an indication of extreme danger and unmistakable warning. Every second of delaying a reversing course increases the probability of global disaster. So, strong words, probably said stronger by him than by me. But it is what it is. We are the closest we've ever been. And as a nation, as a world, as a people, we are the most unprepared we've ever been. Do you think the people of the UK are as prepared now as they were in 1947, when they had to do rationing, when they had to grow their own food, when they had to supply, when we were an island nation and we generated all of our own food and all of our own energy? And look at us now. We are now the closest we've ever been to self-annihilation, and we are the least independent we've ever been. All the more reason to start prepping. This isn't about fear, genuinely, but as a prepper, it makes me think this might not just be a hobby. I might have to use a lot of this stuff. It might not be something direct to us, it might not be a direct strike on us, but the knock-on effects from any sort of global conflict, any sort of major climate shift can affect us. So being as prepared as you can be for your family and the immediate people around you is the least you can do. And it's our kind of little insurance policy. And I know this is a scary video, but it's not designed to make you fear. Don't go and build your bunker tomorrow. We still have time. There is still time to prep sensibly and to your means. But as long as you're taking them first steps towards it. And don't forget, your first steps don't have to cost a fortune. There's loads of budget ways to prep. There's loads of free ways to prep. If you're foraging for food, if you're preserving things in old-fashioned ways. If you're just making a plan, you are more prepared than a lot of people. Let me know what you think of the Doomsday Clock. It's interesting that we are so close to midnight, yet many years ago, climate change wasn't even a factor. So I wonder if it was a factor, if it wouldn't have looked as much of an extreme change if we'd have always been this close. And that's for those of you that even believe in climate change, because I know even that amongst our community is a yes, maybe, no subject. Love to hear your comments on this one, guys. Thanks for staying tuned and watching the video. Thanks for your support on the channel. Don't forget to like, subscribe, leave a comment, all that lovely stuff. Go check out the merch shop. Get your awesome t-shirts that are not political at all down there. And I will see you all in the next video. Goodbye.